forested area would be possibly a little bit easier than going from pasture. And then you're dealing with a weed bank that exists in all topsoil, and that weed bank is just decades of weed seeds that have accumulated. And the second you bring them to the surface, they're just going to proliferate everywhere. And then along with that, the encroachment of as good of a job as you can do of clearing out, whether it's pasture land, shrubbery, whatever it is, into a garden area. You know, nature's going to want to take back over that space just as a natural progression. And then also, not all soils are well suited for growing vegetables and may take considerable amendment. That's a lot of rocky soils. It's just not worth your time to try to work into. If you're digging out, you know, 60% of your soil is boulders and rocks, you're probably better off just building on top of that. And at the same time, some clays can be very expansive and compacted that, you know, they take a lot of work to get into a condition where you can really grow. So some of the methods you might consider if you're going to grow in native soils would be just traditional plowing and tillage. And the picture there to the right is the picture of our plot that we converted through plowing and then later tilling, and then also creating raised beds by scooping to a raised bed to create pathways. Then there's occultation and tillage, which is a combination of covering soil to kill off all the weeds and native grasses or shrubs, and then going with tillage to create tilth and an area that you can actually work with in terms of soil. Lasagna gardening, which can have a bunch of different meanings, you know, from a permaculture meaning of really stacking, you know, a foot of soil and creating all of your topsoil, to just, you know, creating some kind of weed block and putting some compost on top of it. Same thing, deep compost mulch is a way of just covering up, and you know, if you have a cleared area, you can use just compost mulch on top of that area to reduce your weed pressure and to create better fertility and also more workable soil. And double digging, I'll just give a brief review of. It's a very labor-intensive method that's used a lot in biodynamics. So plowing and tillage, the way we approached it was we had someone that we actually hired with a large Kubota tractor come in, plow our land to remove the top inch of, you know, all of our pasture and the roots and scrape off as much of that as possible. And then after that was done, then we still needed to till to get the deep tilth down to, you know, 6 to 8 inches below the soil surface to be able to work in there. And that's what you would need to do with any size. You know, these examples are obviously for our farm, and these are on farm scale, but these can be reduced to a 10 by 20 plot, you know, anything small, you know, up to homestead kind of scale where you're producing hopefully all of your own produce by yourself. But the right there is an example of 400-foot rows that I did just with the BCS tractor. It's a walk-behind tractor that we use. It has a plow attachment. And it took me probably the better part of 60 man-hours to break through just pure pasture and then have to till and then shape all the beds. But those beds are still in pretty good shape right now. We've since kind of moved from the idea of just plowing and tilling because of the fact that, you know, you can do your best. You can go through and pick out as many of the grass roots and those rhizomes out of the soil as you think you can find, but there's still going to be some deep down there that are going to want to come back and kind of retake that area, and there's going to be other grasses that are going to creep in as well. So other methods are occultation and tillage, and occultation just means that you're covering with something that is translucent, so you're not allowing the sunlight to go through, and that, however, that heat is then making the seeds germinate and the roots from the grasses beneath the surface of that tarp or whatever you're using grow. And as it grows, it's not exposed to sunlight, so it's dying off in a matter of a couple of weeks. And it requires the covering with either, you know, you can use a tarp if you're doing a small area. We use silage tarps that come in, you know, much longer lengths and are more economical. If you're going from dense grass or other ground cover, the best way to approach this is to mow to the shortest setting that you can. So cutting down all that growth, let things kind of die back a little bit, then cover for a minimum of a month. So a month is about what we do at the beginning of the grow season, starting in like the end of February or whenever the ground's free of snow. we'll cover with silage tarps for as long as we can until we need to get plants in the ground. And when you go and pull back those tarps, you're going to see a lot of, really leggy weed seedlings and grasses that are white or pale yellow that are very easy to then, kind of cultivate out or even rake out. And then if you do this method, it's best to continue to cover in the off season to keep down weeds. And so the top picture is as we were first preparing our garden beds, we covered, then had the plow come in. And then we did the same process on this bottom picture here is a 30 by 100 foot plot that we prepared for the high tunnel that you can see in construction there that was tarped for the better part of 6 months. And we pulled back the tarps on that and there were no weeds left. It was incredibly easy to get through with just a very light till pass in the lowest setting. And it had some of the best tilth and moisture consistency that I've ever seen in any of our soil. There are some concerns. People will say that, if you're tarping and you've got black surface over there, you're superheating your soil. That's true, but you're only doing that for about the top, quarter inch of your soil, and below that is naturally cooled by the earth. So you're not really killing off any microbial activity or anything like that. That's a real concern. So the next method would be lasagna gardening. And this picture here is an example of, the permaculture extreme of trying to literally create soil over top of another surface by using a barrier such as cardboard or paper and any other natural weed block, and then covering over with layers of mixed organic material, mixturing, carbon-rich, nitrogen-rich, carbon-rich, nitrogen-rich. And, this is a long-term solution, not something that you can do and then plant in that season realistically. However, you can get a quicker turnaround if you just do cardboard, craft paper, and a really good quality compost to a layer of about 6 inches. That'll allow you enough depth to get a lot of shorter, shallow root crops in there in preparation for being able to grow deeper root things like tomatoes and peppers. And by, the end, if you start this in the spring and then by the fall, late summer, that barrier beneath, as long as you've been watering, will pretty much have broken down and that soil beneath it will be soft enough that the roots can extend into there. And so deep compost mulch is that last example that I gave of lasagna gardening. It's somewhere in between where a lot of people will use deep compost mulch, not just with cardboard and creating new beds, but if you have an area that's a little bit weedy and you want to just suppress weeds and also create tilth without a lot of labor and using a tiller and disturbing the soil, this is a no-till way to establish soil very quickly. You can plant directly into compost as long as it's something that's not very high in nitrogen. So it's best to use a source that's not from composted manure and is usually a higher carbon to nitrogen ratio, something like 30 to 1. Co-composted, a lot of woody organic material is best, and you can just use that as garden soil. And if you want to go to a further extreme and you want to try to do this over, you have some grass that's still in an area that you've cleared out, you can put down some cardboard, lay some deep compost, and then just use that to grow into and start out with shallow root vegetables or plants, and then move your way up into things that need more depth of soil. And double digging, like I said, this is something that's used a lot in biodynamics. It's very labor intensive, but it is worth it if you're going to do a very small intensive garden area. So you have a 10 by 20 area that you want to try to get the most out of, but that's all you want to manage. Then double digging can work, but you're going to have to put some elbow grease in. And the steps are generally to clear all existing plant growth, broad fork, or use like a garden fork to loosen up the top 6 inches of soil. Place that to the side, broad fork even deeper to beyond 12 inches, and then kind of replace as you go along in a line, moving the top layer onto the other one. And there's an infographic to the right there that kind of shows the process. It provides really good tilth where you can get soil that's loose enough that you can get your arm in almost up to your elbow. And that creates good soil health because then you're limiting compaction and the need for weeds to come in that want to overtake because of compaction, like dandelions, thistles, and knapweed. And then there's variations that you can do on this using tillage. And one example of that is that first slide that I provided, where we tilled our property and then took some of the loose soil from the pathways, laid it on top to create deeper beds. And so that'll give you the extra tilth that you want to get started immediately and create some nice convenient pathways in between to get started and be able to grow any type of crop that you want there. And it's kind of like an in-between of double digging and just tillage. And I want to just list some valuable tools here that you'll need to manage any garden area. And these are all hand tools for cultivating and maintaining that soil and keeping it so that it's growing well for you over the years. And one of them is a good quality rake that's close to the width of your bed. You're going to want to remove weed debris and grass roots and other things as you're establishing your garden. So a good quality rake is worth its weight in gold. A stirrup, wire, and collinear hoe. If you're not familiar with them, they're just different head shapes of a hoe. The stirrup hoe is also called a hula hoe. Something you kind of just shake back and forth. It's for deeper cultivation, whereas the wire and collinear hoe are meant for small, tight spaces to work in between plants. The picture here is a broad fork. If most people probably aren't familiar, it's more of a market garden scale tool, but it is very valuable. However, they are expensive to purchase brand new. So if you could find one used, that would be ideal, because you can maintain great tilth and not have to till your soil ever again if you have a broad fork and are able to just kind of work the soil, once every season to make sure that you're not getting compaction in there. And then also just a wheelbarrow to save your back. And I'll leave everybody with one last piece of advice, and that's just to start off doing just the amount that you think you can manage. Anything more than that is just going to devalue your experience and add stress. If you try to manage more than you can actually handle, you're going to end up with weeds. You're going to end up with mistakes. You might be putting out row cover and forget to cover something back up, and then deer get to it, or you just don't have the time to spend throughout the area. So try to figure out an area that is reasonable to you and start with that, and you can always grow moving forward. And that's the best way to have success, is to not have discouragement and to not have failures that make you want to kind of give up. And I think I started out in probably like an 8x6 garden area and grew a couple peppers and tomatoes and broccoli and things like that. And after having success, I just felt like I was ready to tackle the world. And I think that's a good thing for everybody, to start out with that level of success to give you the encouragement to continue on and explore everything a little bit further.
Everybody can see it. We're good. So I am going to go ahead and pass it along to Chris. Just a moment. Let me start the slideshow, and Chris, take it away again.
Okay. So as I said briefly before, I think the winter is a great time to think about your garden. And I've been gardening a number of years, but I still love learning and rereading books. And these are some of my favorite gardening books and websites. As I mentioned, I think there's some valuable information online. And then feeding your soil life is the key to feeding your plants. So that's something that I think in the last 10 years, you hear more and more from all kinds of farmers and gardeners. So in the fall, if you can, you should prepare for your spring garden. I live in Kalispell. There are all kinds of leaves that are just taken to the dump. I ask neighbors if I can rake their leaves. I gather and I cover all my garden beds with leaves that it kind of insulates the soil a little bit, and then they break down. The soil life uses them a little bit. And even, it's interesting, the soil does freeze, but in the spring, when things start to thaw, if you just rake away some of the leaves, you'll see the little worms right underneath. And then I've been able to purchase the composted cow manure from Kalispell Creamery. I think that's an excellent product. You can get a truck full for about $20, which is reasonable. So this is what one of my established beds looked like about 6 weeks ago. You can see the leaves, and then I had quite a few sunflowers that grew in this space. So I just cut them at the base and lay them on top of the leaves, because you'll get the wind in the fall, and sometimes the leaves are blowing all over everywhere, and that actually really helped. Under that white fabric was the potting soil from the containers that I used. I just emptied that out, and then just to the left of that, it's a little hard to see, is a pile of the compost from the creamer. I went out in the fall and I got a truck full, and then as I had harvested and cleaned up the beds for winter, I put little stashes, little piles of the compost in the garden to just overwinter, so it would be ready in the spring for me to just to use. Okay, and so that's the same area. On May 1st, I had just kind of cleaned it up. I bagged a lot of the leaves. I have those. I might use them as mulch on top after I get things planted, but I've also just composted the leaves, and that makes a really nice product. So this bed's ready to be planted later in the month with all the warm season crops. This is another established bed that has leaves, and then there's a pile of compost that was kind of partially dug into that's in the upper part of the picture. And then a little hard to see is kind of the bare area in the middle with the little log. That is where I planted garlic last September. And I put a little bit of extra deer netting over it just to keep the neighbors' cats out and the squirrels. And then this is a picture of one area of a little compost that I have. Is maybe 2 feet by 2 feet, where I had put just bags of leaves, and in 2 years, I left it 2 years, it turned into just this beautiful leaf compost. I have another compost area, and I do a cold composting process where, as the season goes on, I just put the garden debris, all the clippings, on top of the pile, and then by winter, I just leave it, and maybe it has compressed about a foot, and about half of that, if I took the top half off, underneath there would be lots of worms, there would be lots of good compost. The rough debris on top, what I'll do with that is I'll sometimes just chop it up, and I will place that in between the beds in the garden to walk on. So it's a way of just covering the soil. It kind of composts in place in the garden through the season. Shawn kind of covered this part of it, and I was just thinking, if your new garden is going to be replacing lawn or planted in a weeding area, boy, you're either going to have to remove the lawn or smother it. That's the two different methods I've used. So this picture is a kind of a hybrid bed that I did just a couple weeks ago. The back portion of the bed that has the cedar boards, that was an established raised bed that was surrounded by cottonwood rounds. The cottonwood had started to degrade. That was good for about 5 years, but then it started to rot and grass grew up through the center of it. So I took all those rounds and split them and used them as a little retaining wall. And underneath that is about 3 layers of cardboard. And then on top of the cardboard is some just rough clippings and debris. I wetted that down really well. If you're gonna smother your lawn with the cardboard, it's a really good idea to get that cardboard really saturated and wet. beforehand, because otherwise it's going to be kind of a barrier. And then behind that bed, the rectangular area near the fence, I had to remove some soil from that. I'm going to be putting in a little greenhouse. So that soil was fairly nice topsoil, and I used that to top that bed off. And then this is a picture of my son's garden. He prepared these two beds. And what he did is kind of a variation of the double digging. What he did is he took the top like 6 inches with the grass, cut that out with a shovel and placed it on a big tarp. And then he dug down another 1.5 foot and placed that soil on a different tarp. And then as he went, he put the grass side down into the hole and then filled that foot back on top of the grass. So that was a lot of work, but it did stifle the grass. It's a really heavy soil where these gardens are in Kalispell, so the compost has been really an important element. But in 5 years, you will see an incredible difference if you feed your soil with compost and then the leaves every fall. And then this is one of my favorite tools. It's a little edger, and it's really good for removing lawn. It goes down about 5 inches, and it makes it easy to just take out little sections at a time. And then I will just shake as much of the soil off as I can. And the grass is just tough. I have not figured out how to compost that. So I usually just send it to the dump, which makes me feel sad. I haven't figured out how to do that. Okay, so this is an area where in the foreground, I weeded by hand where the pavers are. That was all grass, and it was a tremendous amount of work. So the next season, I bought the raised beds, and they're just on lawn. I put cardboard down, the beds on top. And this was the process. So if you do a pretty thick layer of cardboard, and then once again, wet it down really well. And then I had all this rough debris left over from the compost pile. I put that on top of the cardboard. And then I had some extra soil and some compost, and I kind of layered the soil, the compost, and I put the potting soil on top of that, and then planted into it. So this was like greens that were planted mid-April, and I had started them inside under lights in my basement. Might be a little hard to see, but it's lettuce, and then there's kale. And so the lettuce is going to grow and probably be good until June, mid-June, and then it's just going to be too hot. I can take that out. The kale will have grown up and kind of covered the bed. If there's a little bit of space, you could I could do a row of carrots between the kale too. So it's kind of interesting to try to think about how you can use the space you have through the season. And then Brooke did a good job of showing all the containers. These are the ones that I use. Some of them I just save. If I purchase plants, the 4-inch, I just save them and I wash them out, clean them. The others I have purchased, and those last several years, I just keep washing them out and reusing them. Then I built some little cedar propagation boxes, and I really like these. They have like 1/4-inch hardware cloth on the bottom, so there's good drainage. There's like good air underneath, and what I'll do is I'll put maybe one piece of newspaper on the bottom of that, on top of that wire, and then a little layer of leaves, and then put the potting soil on top of that. And it's pretty interesting. As the plants grow, the roots just go right for the leaves. So I think they have a sense that there's, you know, nutrient or something down there for them. And then I use this biodynamic almanac. Maria Thun was a German woman who did a bunch of experiments using the biodynamic methods. And it's kind of using the cycle of the solar system, the moon, the constellations to do your planting. And she showed that it did make a difference when you planted to the vigor of the plants you're planting. And it's a little complex. I don't want to spend a lot of time, but basically there are, you know, days when it's better if the result you want is the fruit of the plant, like corn or a tomato, then you would plant during these days. If you're interested in the flower, it's a different day, or the leaf, it's a different day, or the root, it's a different day. And then I have a notebook, a spiral notebook to record when I sow and just observations. I like to kind of note the seed company and then the year that it was packed, or if I collected it, the year that I collected it. And then generally try to note when it germinates and then when I transplant it. And it's really useful to do that when you can look back in the next season. It helps in planning. And then I just have 2 sets of grow lights in my basement. And I've got a couple boot trays that are on top of this table. So that just is a waterproofing barrier. And I can get about 4 flats into each of those trays. And this is greens and tomatoes that I sowed the end of March. And these are the greens ready to be transplanted into the garden on April 19th. And then this is spinach, lettuce, and some Brussels sprouts that I sowed the end of February and then planted into the garden mid-March. Then shortly after, we had all that really cold winter and the weather and the snow. So I have these old coal frame tops that I put on top of the bed. And actually we had 20-degree nights, and the spinach, the lettuce, the Brussels sprouts were fine. They're pretty cold hardy, but with a little added protection, it makes a big difference. And then this is the bed on May 1st. So I've cut the spinach maybe 3 different times. I'll just take the outer leaves, and I've started harvesting some of the lettuce in the back. The Hori Hori tool is one of my favorite. That I use for weeding, and I use for transplanting. And then when I sow seeds, I'll use it to create a little drill in the garden. Okay, so last August, this bed had potatoes that were harvested. And then I sowed a cover crop of cilantro and oats because I knew we had a couple months still of the growing season. I just left that through the winter, and then started to rake off that debris and added a little bit of compost. And then I sowed radish and carrot seeds on April 16th in that bed. This is what it looked like. This is using the Hori Hori knife to create the drills. And then I covered that with some of this is the Agrabah fabric. It just will protect a little bit from wind. So with carrot seeds, you don't want them to dry out. And then we had rain, which was nice. So that's why it looks so wet. But if I have just transplanted things, often I'll just put some of the Agrabah on top. It just is a nice buffer to protect. Okay, so by early May, these are the plants that are in the garden. And the ones that were seeded under lights in late February to late March, the spinach, the lettuce, the Brussels sprouts. We've got cabbage, kale, chard, parsley, celery, and onion. And then I've seeded directly in the garden the end of March to mid-April, peas, radish, carrot, beets, fava bean, arugula, cilantro, these will all germinate when the soil's still a little bit cool. And then flowers, I've sprinkled some flower seeds in the garden. And it's kind of interesting. I noticed a couple of years ago that by the 1st of May, sunflowers, that the seed had just, been left in the soil over the growing season, were up and germinating. The calendula has been up and growing for probably 10 days or so now. I love alyssum. That's just a great flower. It attracts a lot of beneficial insects. And generally, I just leave the plant in the garden over the winter. And in the spring, the little seeds are still, attached in the plant, and they will just germinate. And the dried plant material is kind of like a little protection for them. So I just wait until I see the seeds have germinated, and then let them grow a bit, and then cut out the dead material from the season before. It's just a picture of the fava beans that were sown in March. I took the picture on May 3rd. And then this garden bed, I sowed some arugula seed, it's on a little slope in the foreground on the left. Arugula will germinate really quickly, and I sowed it thickly. This was seed that I had saved from the garden. And you can, once it's up a couple inches, I usually you cut it, and you can cut, 3 or 4 times before it's gonna stretch into flower and then go to seed. So arugula is something that's really easy to save seed from, and the flowers are actually kind of pretty, and they attract beneficial insects. And then it's a little hard to see, but just in the foreground, those are little onions, started from seed the end of February. And then garlic in the middle of that bed is maybe about 6, 7 inches tall at this point. That was planted in September. And so the warm season veggies, I sowed tomatoes, peppers, basil the end of March inside under the lights. And then I sowed corn 1st of May under lights. I still haven't sown any cucumber or summer winter squash or beans. I'm waiting until it warms up. And then these were the tomatoes that were sown in March and then transplanted into 4-inch on, I think it was April 19th or 23rd or whatever it was.
April 23rd.
They grow pretty quickly. So they came out from under the lights in the basement when I sowed the corn. And what I've been doing is I set them outside on my deck during the day. It faces east, it's protected from the west, the hot afternoon sun. And then I bring them inside at night to the back porch. So this way they experience the fresh air, a little bit of wind, and they even have the benefit of some rain. That's the corn sown. And I like using the cedar boxes for doing the corn because you've got the depth. They're 3.5 inches deep, and you can do about 40, 50 seeds in each one of those little boxes. So it's kind of a handy way to just, usually you're going to want that much corn. And then these are some large pots that I have for growing tomatoes, peppers, eggplant, lemongrass, and they're against a south-facing wall, which makes a difference. We've got the cool nights in the summer. That wall's gonna kind of radiate heat during the evening. And then I empty the soil from the pots in the fall, and then I put leaves in the pot to overwinter. And it's pretty interesting because you can lift the leaves off, and at the bottom couple inches, there are all kinds of worms, and the leaves have started to break down. And then I'll just put fresh potting soil and compost on top for spring planting. And that's just a picture of them with plants. And then I'd say eggplant seems to really like growing in a pot. I've had great luck for the last 3 summers growing the eggplant in these pots. And then this is lemongrass. I love growing lemongrass. I'll use it for tea. So at this point, this is just before I was harvesting it and cutting it up to dry. And so that's what I've done so far this season.
Excellent.
Yeah.
Excellent. I will, let's see, log off from here. All right. Well, thank you both, Shawn and Chris. It was really informative. Really enjoyed listening to all the tips, and just wanted to stop here and see if anybody has questions for the team, or if you just want to share your thoughts about what you're starting in your garden and any questions you might have about specific plants and what's easy to grow. So there's a couple of, I won't read the comments, it's in the chat box if you just want to read the comments by by other folks who are participating.
Yeah.
I'll just read the questions. So question from Geffen, do you leave the arugula just like that there, or do you thin it?
I leave it just like that. And I'll do cilantro the same way. I'll just sow it thickly because it's really easy to let the cilantro go to flower and then go to seed. And it's really, if you sow it thickly, then it's really easy to harvest too. You're just snipping. And
Yeah.
You can snip the cilantro maybe 3 times before it'll go to flower.
Very cool. Any info on growing asparagus?
It's worth having asparagus in your garden. The one thing I'd say is I planted a bed of asparagus, and it's in a place that what happens is in the summer it's going to push up these large ferny stems. It takes up a lot of space. If I could do it over, I would have put the asparagus off in a corner because it's always blocking sun and it's hard to get around, but it's delicious. And actually, I think the last week I've been cutting asparagus every day. So it's worth planting. And I was going to try to move the asparagus. It's been in the ground about 4 years. I was going to try to do that last fall, and I couldn't even get into the soil to lift it out. So I think once you've got it in, it's not that easy
Right.
to get it out.
Shawn, did you have any thoughts about asparagus?
Yeah, just keep in mind it is perennial, so it's going to stay where it is. It's going to take, probably the 3rd year from when you plant rooted cuttings, or if you buy dried roots to get a valuable crop. And then you need to plan for the fact that it's going to be there, and anytime you have something perennial, there's going to be more and more weeds to deal with, because if you're not actively turning over that area to get new crops in there, then that's when long-term perennial weeds like thistle, knapweed, and other things set in. So using weed fabric or deep mulch is pretty much necessary with asparagus.
Great, thanks, Shawn. Next question, what are the dimensions of the planting boxes that you showed?
So they're 4 feet by 8 feet. And then they're about a foot deep, maybe a little bit taller than a foot.
Great. Question from Nora. Can I please see again the slides about seeding times outdoors? This is Isa. I will post a recording of this session as well as the slides, assuming that's okay with both Chris and Shawn, on the website. So, you can look at them at your leisure. And I have some other presentations that might be helpful as well as you think about what you want to plant. So because that presentation, we closed it down already, so it's not that easy to reopen it, but I will be sure to have those up on the site in the next couple days. All right. And so the question was, is it on the Free the Seeds website? I guess that's kind of an important piece. Yes. The website is Free the Seeds Montana, and Montana is spelled out, .com. And the presentations will be under the Build Skills section. So freetheseedsmontana.com/build-skills. I think that it's in the menu if you just go to the site. And as we get more information, we hope to continue building this as a resource. So we will definitely have that up there. Okay, what about the dimensions of the boxes you use to germinate the seeds?
Oh, yeah, I think they're like 10 inches wide and about 19 inches long. So they're a little bit smaller than a kind of a conventional flat. But I like that size because it fits into my boot trays better.
Yeah, that's great. Any other?
And actually those the little germination boxes, it's 1 by 4 cedar. So the depth is 3.5 inches.
Sounds perfect. Shawn, did you have any additional thoughts about germination or anything along those lines that might be helpful?
No, I mean, we obviously do things on a much different scale than a home garden, but the process is still the same. You know, those flats that Chris had shown, there's a couple places to get them. Greenhouse Megastore is a really good resource. They have pretty much every cell count, dimension, everything available that you can imagine. You know, we tend to do smaller plug sizes because we just have to produce so much, and greenhouse space is at a premium. But if you're starting out, the larger the transplant, the healthier the plant will be when you go to transplant it. So if you can do a larger transplant and keep it in a protected space for longer, before it goes into the ground, there'll be less transplant shock, and the plant will do overall better than it would have if you put it in much smaller.
Great, thanks, Shawn. We have another question from Nora about composting. And her question, can I just place the kitchen scraps and garden clippings into the bed and cover it with soil and then plant on top?
That's not recommended just because a lot of those things are very high nitrogen. So you always want a good balance of nitrogen. And not to mention, I mean, if you put kitchen scraps into a bed, then you're going to be attracting pests, number one, and it's not going to break down as fast as you want it to. There's a lot of good resources out there through Free the Seeds. People have done on composting. And it's important to keep in mind that you need a balance between carbon and nitrogen when you're composting, especially if you're going to be hot composting something. And what Chris had mentioned before, and the easiest way to get into composting is to start out with very high carbon organic matter, which is your leaves, wood chips, dried materials, like what they call your browns, and just do it slower, and, you know, don't want something immediately. You know, the only immediate injection of fertility that you can really give to your garden is a ready-made fertilizer or something else that is, you know, in the right proportions. You don't want to just be throwing things out there. It can be throwing off the nitrogen or the potassium or the, you know, other levels of the nutrients in your soil by not letting them kind of get to the stability that they need through the composting process.
Great answer. Any other thoughts, Chris, from you on composting?
Yeah, the kitchen scraps are a little bit tricky. So in the past, I've used the can of worms, where you use the red worms. You have to be kind of careful with that. And then you've got the cold winter here that you need to deal with. So actually, I have done different things. Sometimes I will just put the kitchen scraps on top of the compost bed, and they just kind of disappear over time. When I lived in California, you could take the kitchen scraps and just, we had a large property. I would just dig a hole and bury them, and oh, they disappear so quickly.
Yeah.
It was interesting.
Yeah. We have room for time for one more question. If anybody has a question, real quick. All right. If not, just want to mention next session, we're going to be talking a lot about composting and maintaining healthy soil. So I will be sending a registration link out to the list the Sunday before the 13th, which I think is next Sunday. And we can, dive more deeply into that, as well as other methods for keeping and maintaining healthy soil, companion planning, and all that. Resources from this session will be on freetheseasmontana.com. Very shortly, as soon as I get to it. It doesn't take long to upload them, so it should be there relatively quickly. And just wanted to give a quick plug we are working to help folks with saving seeds. So if you are interested in getting some hand-holding around which plants to save seed from and how to do it, you can send an email to seeds@freetheseasmontana.com. And we will get somebody to help you with that. Gretchen Boyer and Sandy Birch are spearheading that. So never too early to get started. So thanks everybody for attending today. Again, it'll be up on the site shortly, and hope to see you next time. And thanks for Shawn and Chris for participating and presenting today.
Well, thank you, Carol.
Thanks.
Lisa.
All right. Bye-bye.